Peak Human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
Peak 人間
Hello there! We're back for season 6. I can't wait to kick this off, and I'm really sorry it took so long to arrive. I had a million things going on working on the Food Lies film back home in Hawaii, and also when I got back to LA. Also, a couple interviews fell through. I did focus on getting some more video content out on YouTube, so check out the Food Lies channel. There's a ton of short and sweet content to keep you educated and entertained. My number one goal of Peak Human is to have top quality informative content, quality over quantity. I also wanted to not have any conflicts of interest, so I decided from day one to not have any sponsors. This also allows me to have top quality guests at my own pace. If I was making money per episode, I'd have all kinds of random people on because I'd be incentivized to do so. Instead, I briefly mention my own projects and companies before each episode and have guests I really want to have on and take some time off if I need to. So what's going on with me? Well, we made an epic intro to Food Lies that took months of planning and all kinds of resources. It's a 4.5 minute piece with 130 shots, each which took many hours to prepare and shoot. This film is going to be something special. As I've said before, we could have rushed something out that was a B+ by last fall. We were going for an A+, which might take a year longer though. You can continue to support its costly creation on Indiegogo by clicking through foodlies.org. The trailer there is very outdated and was created with almost no budget, so it's not representative of the final project. We'll redo this at some point. I also have been fired up about nose to tail. I served some of the grass-finished primal ground beef with liver, heart, kidney, and spleen at the meetup we had in West LA this past weekend. It was a huge hit and went very quickly. It's so delicious, you don't taste the organs. It just tastes like richer, more nutrient-dense meat, especially if you add a little seasoning in. We have all kinds of great stuff on nosetotale.org. That's all sustainably and ethically raised, beyond organic, high omega-3, and extra tasty. Per popular demand, I've been making some cooking videos and I'm just finishing my 15-minute workout routine video for Patreon members. I only work out 4 times per week for 15 minutes and have seen great results. If you go to patreon.com/peakhuman and join as a supporter, you'll get these private videos and also support this podcast and everything else I do. I really appreciate everyone who has stepped up and done this. I honestly turn down sponsors each and every week because I don't want to promote other people's products and get caught up in all that. Even if I totally agree with what they're selling, it's just a few bucks per month at patreon.com/peakhuman or click through the link in my Instagram bio. My Instagram is where most of the action takes place daily. If you're not following me there, my handle is food.lies. That's it. Give the show a review on iTunes or click on the 1 through 5 stars in the podcast app if you'd like to do something that's free. You can also share any of my content with family and friends, of course. So here's a bit about my guest today. David R. Montgomery is a MacArthur Fellow and Professor of Geomorphology at the University of Washington. He is an internationally recognized geologist who studies landscape evolution and the effects of geological processes on ecological systems and human societies. An author of award-winning popular science books, he has been featured in documentary films, network and cable news, and on a wide variety of TV and radio programs, including Nova, PBS, NewsHour, Fox and Friends, and All Things Considered. His books have been translated into 9 languages. He also travels the country speaking and educating on regenerative practices. I first caught wind of him from his excellent book Dirt, Erosion of Civilizations, and I'm halfway done with his book Growing a Revolution. Listen to this interview and you'll probably want to grab them both. He's an awesome guy doing great things. Although soil seems like a boring topic, trust me, there's a lot more to it, and a ton of great info in this interview. Without further ado, here's Professor David Montgomery. Well, let's get rolling here. We got David Montgomery here. Welcome.
Hey, thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Sure thing. Yeah, I'm excited. I've read your book a while back and it's come up on multiple podcasts. I believe Lear Keith first brought it up. If you're familiar with her at all, she wrote The Vegetarian Myth.
Oh.
I think she used a lot of your ideas in her book and talked about Dirt, your book.
Oh, good. Hopefully she mentioned the book. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I first heard of you. So yeah, well, first of all, are you up in Seattle? I can't trust everything I read on Wikipedia, but apparently you're a professor of Earth and Space Sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle.
That is all true. Yeah, I'm a geologist by training, and my day job is teaching at the University of Washington, where I teach the sort of the here and now of geology. Geomorphology is the study of the surface of the Earth. So, I got into looking at soils primarily through the lens of erosion and how natural landscapes are formed by erosional processes.
Yeah, that's great. So geology, you got the degree from Stanford, and then you have BS in geology, and then the PhD in geomorphology from UC Berkeley. And you wrote a couple books. So I read your more recent book, which we'll get into later. But just so everyone knows, we're talking about Dirt is the name of the book, Erosions of Civilization. Let's start there. So you started getting into soil from geology. They're very related. How did it go down to get to your first book?
Well, Dirt actually turns out was my second book. The first one was about salmon. It was about fish, an even weirder thing for a geologist to write about. But it was called King of Fish, the 1,000-year run of salmon. And I got into writing about that because I had been working on the way that logging practices influence salmon habitat in the rivers of the Pacific Northwest after I moved to Seattle and took a job teaching at the University of Washington. And a part of that is how clear cutting causes landslides. And it's about erosion and how soil moves off of hillsides and into rivers and out to the ocean. So I've sort of professionally studied erosion for a long time, worked on, every continent other than Antarctica, looking at erosional processes. And when it came time to write what became my second book, the Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations book, I thought, what I really want to do is write about the history of soil erosion and civilization and, how people have treated the land through millennia. And as I got more and more into it, what I realized I was actually writing was a history of farming, because that was the bottom line for a lot of the impact of human societies on soils then affected those societies down the road and the descendants of the people who actually caused the erosion. So I got into looking at soils from the perspective of a geologist who thinks about how fast does nature build soils? How does the way erosional processes remove soil, how does that shape the land? And I ended up looking at what's the role of farming practices on making soils vulnerable to erosion, and what happens to societies and civilizations that actually abuse their soil for long enough? How does that impact their longevity and stability? And that's essentially what I wrote the Dirt about, is putting all those pieces together. It was a fun journey. Involved too much library work and not enough traveling around the world to see interesting ruins. But that's the curse of the writer. You never get to go as many places as you really want to go.
Yeah, well, actually, it sounds like you kind of did that after, though. Doing Growing a Revolution, you got to travel around and look at some farms and different practices and putting in place. But still, let's focus on Dirt first. It's so interesting. Yeah, you're saying that the farming methods influence the most, and this is what so the big topic of debate, and there's this kind of vegan propaganda or kind of backlash out there that's all the cows or that's all this or all that, but really we're talking about it's a land management.
Yeah, there's a lot of arguments today about, what we should eat. And there's all kinds of reasons to argue for a vegan or vegetarian diet. And there's all kinds of reasons to argue that we need dairy and we need meat in our diet because we're omnivores. But the part that usually gets left out of those arguments is the part that I think is actually more important, which is how we raise our food, whether it's our plant-based foods or whether it's our animal-based foods. It's actually the sort of how we raise them and whether that actually helps to build soil health or degrade soil health. To me, that's the kind of bottom line in terms of how we should be farming, how we should be eating. We should be growing food and consuming foods that actually the act of growing it leaves the land better off than if we weren't doing it.
That's the biggest thing. That's it right there. It's the how.
Yeah.
It's kind of pointless. I'm stuck in this world. I'm a pro meat person. I'm trying to, spread the message that it's okay to eat, but let's do it in a regenerative way. Let's grow it properly.
Right.
So it's kind of pointless to get into all these like crazy debates. I mean, there's two different debates. We can talk nutrition, but really we need to be talking about how, because you can grow the same foods in completely different ways. And it makes all the difference.
It makes all the difference. And if you look at sort of the gross biogeography of how to feed the world, and you look at, what kind of landscapes can support what kind of agronomic activity, and sort of the applied geomorphology of food, if you will. There's an awful lot of the world that is in semi-arid grasslands that it's really not a good idea to plow up and plant with crops that need a lot of water, because you cause erosional problems. You deplete things like the Ogallala Aquifer in the American Midwest. It's going dry beneath their feet. It's hard to sustain that. But on the other hand, if you look at those same landscapes, grasslands, they're like made for raising ruminants, for raising livestock, whether it's bison or cattle or sheep. You can actually improve the health of the land through the right kind of grazing, regenerative grazing, as you were mentioning. And so I think when we think about what we should be eating, we really can't avoid the question of, well, how was it grown? Because if you basically look at the way we're raising livestock globally today, it's kind of a mess. We treat the animals poorly. It degrades the land. We turn their manure, which should be a resource, we turn it into a hazard. The whole system in terms of confined animal feeding operations is one that really needs to change. And you put that up against food grown on an organic vegetable farm, and one of those has a better environmental footprint than the other, pretty clearly.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I've been on a number of organic farms in the last couple of years that have utterly destroyed their soil, because they're using the wrong practices for building soil health. They're tilling too much, plowing too much, in great part. And if you put that food up against a really well-managed, regeneratively grazed meat or dairy product, the meat or dairy product actually has a lower environmental footprint. Now, you can't get around the sort of the 10-to-1 energetics of when you go up each trophic level, each level in the food chain. It's less efficient to eat high on the food chain. There's no way around that argument. But it may not be the right argument to be had about all kinds of food, because of that overlay of how we grow it and where we grow it, whether it makes sense to, be tilling things up in semi-arid grasslands to grow grains when, there's one thing that we cannot eat. It's the cellulose-rich parts of plants, of grains. We can't eat wheat stubble. But cows can turn it into meat and milk.
Exactly. Well, I was going to say there's some nuance to that trophic level argument too, is that the animals can eat food that humans can't eat. So
bingo.
I've had I had Dr. Frank Mitloner, UC Davis professor. I've had Gabe Brown on, if you've heard of him. He does North Dakota, is a big 5,000 acre no-till farm, all the good holistic management.
Yeah, no, I met Gabe. I wrote a chapter about him, and in the back half of Growing Revolution, he gets a whole chapter.
I didn't make it there yet.
He's inspirational.
He's the best. He travels around speaking, and actually you do as well. You travel around speaking about these kind of things. But let's get back to the big broad strokes of dirt, erosions of civilizations. Just the title alone, it tells a lot. How do civilizations get ruined? There's a quote, I don't know, it's from your book. I got it maybe from reading your book, from Franklin D. Roosevelt: a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. I mean, people knew about this a long time ago.
Oh,
there's an Abe Lincoln quote too.
Yeah, that quote from Roosevelt is from a letter he wrote to the governors of all the then 48 states in the U.S. back in, I think it was 37 or 38, sort of in the aftermath of the Dust Bowl. There was a lot of focus and emphasis on the problem of soil erosion because of the great damage to the American heartland during the Dust Bowl. And I like to think of the Dust Bowl as a man-made disaster, because it tends to be portrayed as this great drought that caused a lot of human suffering, which it did. But there'd been 12 or so droughts that were comparable in the several thousand years before then that did not cause the soils of the plains to blow away and cover Washington, D.C. and New York, where some of that dust ended up in the Dust Bowl era. The problem was the way the people had prepared the land for the next drought. And so it was sort of an engineered disaster, if you will. And it kind of illustrates the point that if you abuse your soil as a society, and you lose it, whether from wind blowing it off as dust, or whether rain eroding it off down to the ocean, or just degrading the organic matter, so you degrade the life right out of it and sap its fertility. If you do that for long enough, it undermines the ability of the next generation or two or three to really support themselves on that same body of land. And that's the realization I came to in researching and writing the Dirt Book, is not only was there a long history agricultural soil degradation and erosion impacting the ability of people to live on the land where they were. And that helped fuel the whole drive westward of Western civilization from Mesopotamia to the Greeks to the Romans to Western Europe to North America. Has this story of successive degradation of the land that sent people off further to the west in search of fresh new soils to farm. But there was also a history of people recognizing the problem that dates all the way back to the classical Greek philosopher Plato. It's just not been something that has been at the forefront of a lot of concern other than people who have looked at the issue or aware of the land. So I tried to go into a lot of that in the Dirt book and tell that history, tell that story, and to try and highlight its relevance to the problem of feeding the world into the future.
It's so interesting. Yeah. And these civilizations have fallen. You're not saying it's like every single civilization is 100% the soil, but it's always kind of the foundation, and, wars happen and this and that, but maybe it was all tied into degrading the soil. There hasn't been really any big civilization that has made it past 2,000 years about. Right.
Yeah. It's about, 1,000 years plus or minus 50%. It's probably a pretty good estimate of the lifespan of most major agricultural civilizations. And there's a couple really key exceptions, which are places like, they've been farming in Mesopotamia and the Tigris and Euphrates River for thousands of years, or the Nile in Egypt, the Indus and the Brahmaputra in India, or the big rivers of lowland China. They're all places where people have farmed the same land for a long time. But there's something that those areas all share in common, and that is that they're big river floodplains. And, what do we know happens on a floodplain? Well, it floods, and the flood brings not only water, it brings sediment, it brings organic matter. It basically replenishes the fertility of the land that is frequently flooded. So the low-lying land by a river on a floodplain is a place where you can get away with erosive farming practices because nature's rebuilding the damage fairly rapidly. And once you get outside of big river floodplains and you start farming on hillsides, as soon as you start plowing and you disturb the vegetative cover of the ground surface, it accelerates the erosional processes because the plants tend to hold the soil together. You can walk up to any plant, try and pull it out of the ground, and it's like rooted, right? And that's holding the soil in place as well as the plant. A plow is really good at undoing that by inverting the soil, which makes it superb weed control, which is why it's been very popular in society after society. But it also makes it terrible for soil erosion. Societies that have grown to the point where they're relying on farming outside of their floodplains run the risk over time of coming to depend, with a growing population, coming to depend on a shrinking area of arable land as it gets degraded out from under that growing population. And the thesis that I put forward in Dirt is that sort of tension, if you will, between sort of a growing population and a declining amount of fertile land has set the stage for how civilizations play out their life cycles. From growing when they have a small population and a lot of rich fertile land, the population can grow. And when the opposite happens, you get a very large population on land that is shrinking or has been degraded, it becomes progressively harder to actually maintain that society, which makes them vulnerable to things like the droughts that affected classical Egypt, or the American Midwest and the Dust Bowl, or the incursions of their neighbors, the whole sort of politics and war and people behaving badly that you read about through most history books. What you don't read about is how the state of the land actually set the stage for that play to really play out on.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. So what are the oldest examples of this?
Well, the oldest one goes back to really Mesopotamia, and it's less about erosion than it is about about salinization. Because if you look back at the old records, those cuneiform records, those baked clay tablets that have those weird, that writing of just lines that are impressed on baked clay, or on clay that then got baked to make it a permanent record. Some of those records from Mesopotamia tell of the changing nature of the crops that they were growing on the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates River. Over time, more and more salt-tolerant crops were feeding the populace in that region, over centuries. And that reflects sort of the degradation of the soil because they were irrigating with water at the start of their summer, because they were getting most of their water from snowmelt off the Zagros Mountains in modern Iran. And that water would run down the rivers to the fields of Mesopotamia in modern Iraq. Actually, I think the headwaters were in Syria. Now I'm thinking about the geography, right? But in any case, the water that was being used for irrigation would then evaporate on the fields because it was snow melt from the mountains that ran down in the summer. So it was at the start of the summer, it would be let onto their fields, it would evaporate. And what happens when you evaporate water? All the salts that are held in it get left in the soil. So if you do that generation after generation, they literally turn their fields white with salt. Now, in Egypt at the same time, they were irrigating along the banks of the Nile, but the timing was different. They were getting their water from the river, whose high, and the high flow in the river came right about at the time of the growing season. So they were irrigating with less water right at the time that the plants would pull it up. So there was less water that evaporated in their fields. And so they didn't have the same salinization problems. Once you then go to Turkey and Greece and then on to Rome and into Western Europe, the whole soil erosion problem became the much more critical part of soil degradation, or into Syria or Libya and other places that are sort of the poster children today, if you will, of the effect of land degradation on multiple generations of descendants. We've got good Roman tax records of high harvests of wheat from Syria and Libya, where today you'd be hard-pressed to grow much of a crop. It's not because the climate's changed there, it's because the soil's gone.
Well, what civilizations figured it out? Because it seems so many people did it poorly, but who figured it out?
Well, there's a couple examples. My favorite example is a small island in the Pacific called Tikopia, which some anthropologists studied in I think it was the 1920s or 30s. And they basically found that the inhabitants of this island, which is I think only a few square miles, it's a small place, they had turned their whole island into what you might today call a permaculture garden. They were growing 3 stories of crops, an understory, a middle story, and tree crops. They were recycling organic matter. They had built their soil quality up. But they managed to actually maintain that society over the long run. By every few generations, they would send a whole bunch of their kids out on canoes and tell them to go find their own island. So it was not exactly the best social model, but it worked for preserving the fertility of their land. The Inca are another example down in South America. Their terracing is amazing. There's still some Incan terraces where they took steep hillsides in a fairly dry bit of their environment, and they terraced them. So they built little steps and then flat bits, and they were growing crops on the flat bits, and they would take their urban waste, their sort of household organic matter, and they'd return it back to their terraces to build up the fertility of their soil. And you can still go today and run soil tests on their terraces versus the native soil right next door, and the soil the Inca built is better than the native soil. And of course, the best example are the terra pretas, the black earths of the Amazon, Equatorial Africa, and they've even been found in Northern Europe, the so-called Nordic terra pretas, which are all organic matter rich, really fertile soils that were built up by multiple generations of human activity, which turn out to be much like the activity that led my wife and I to write our second book, The Hidden Half of Nature. That's sort of the composting and mulching and returning organic matter to the land. It really works to build up soil health and soil organic matter.
Yeah, I'm so interested in that. I heard about that years ago from, I think it was even Graham Hancock, just about the Amazon and this black earth. And was there anything like magical about it? Like, do we know how it's made?
It's pretty astounding. I took a trip down the Amazon for research in my job as a geologist years ago, where we started off at the sort of the bottom of the Andes and the headwaters of the Amazon, and went for about a month in canoes. And we passed one village the entire time. And our job was to basically drill with little hand augers cores into the floodplain. We're trying to look at the record of floods to look at a climate signal, sort of geological research. But we passed through this one village on our way down there. And it was the only place on the entire trip that we saw rich, fertile black earth. Almost all of the soil in the jungle there had hardly any organic matter. It just looked like freshly deposited sand that had been eroded out of the Andes and dumped by the river, which is what it was. This thick jungle growing on it, but you would see anytime like a leaf would fall to the forest floor, the ants would be right on it. There was so much life there that stuff was being turned over really fast. So very little built up in the soil. We then went to this one village where we stopped to buy a bunch of fruit because it was our one place to do that on this trip. The whole village was underlain by, feet of really rich black earth. Basically, how that had been formed is that over many generations, people had been, gathering fruit from the forest, bringing food into town, and they would basically recycle their organic matter through composting and mulching in the vicinity of their village, or in the crops they were growing close to their village. They basically built up the quality of their soil over time. So there's nothing really magic about it. It's sort of about the balance of carbon inputs and what soil life is doing to it, and whether and whether the vegetation is pulling that stuff right back out of the soil, or whether the organic matter and all the micronutrients that are in it are building up in the soil.
Wasn't there something to do with fire, burnt something to add more of that carbon, or was there just a special process to develop it? It seems like other people couldn't do it, couldn't figure out how to make it. Like there was this lost knowledge of how to create this rich soil.
A big piece of the recipe for success in all three of those areas, the African terra pretas, the Amazon, and the European, were the inclusion of charcoal. And we have a shorthand term for that now, biochar, basically partially burned biomass. And charcoal is actually, it's mostly carbon. It's something that helps with the structure and moisture holding characteristics of the soil, but it also has some nutrients within it. And the recipe in each of those three areas, why did they have charcoal to go in? Well, that's because they had cooking fires. And so where are you going to throw your ashes? If you always have a fire going, you produce a lot of charcoal. And then if you spread that around the area around your village over long enough, it starts to build up the organic matter content. So part of it was a sort of a technology, if you will, fire and a cultures that involved keeping cooking fires going all the time and then taking those ashes out to the fields. There's some active controversy over how intentional the formation of many of those soils were, and I'll leave it to the people who study that to really bear out those arguments. But I think it's really clear about how effective the practice was and how much the people who then benefited from it, the descendants of the people who started those practices, they recognized that they had built really good soil because they were living on it.
Well, it's like trial and error. That's how humans figured out a lot of things over time.
Yeah, we're good at that, especially the error part.
Yeah.
I actually found that was a big piece of this recipe for success among the regenerative farmers that I interviewed for Growing a Revolution, was the farmers who tinkered with stuff, who tried stuff, who were unafraid to fail, if you will, were the ones who learned how to improve their practices. And I can't help but believe that had a big part of the role in the societies we're just talking about, too.
Yeah, that's Gabe Brown. He talks about how he's forced to. So many failures, crop failures, hail. Nature works against you, and you're creative, and you keep figuring things out. And societies that figured that out kept going and lived on. What are some other societies that didn't make it? What kind of hit that 1 to 2,000 year range?
Well, I wrote about the Greeks and the Romans are good classical examples of that. There's some stories in Western Europe, particularly sort of Southern Europe, where that was a big piece of that. The one that really surprised me to learn about wasn't, like Angkor Wat or early Chinese agriculture. I'd sort of known something about that. But the part that I had not been taught in school was how big a role soil erosion played in the colonial and post-colonial history of the United States and the degradation of land on the eastern seaboard from like Virginia down to the Carolinas, and how that helped, how the degradation of land in the 18th and early 19th centuries helped propel the American push west, because there were these great fertile soils of the Great Plains. And once the eastern seaboard had been eroded, the topsoil had been eroded off, farmers were very interested in moving west, in part because out of desperation and in part out of opportunity.
Well, I remember you saying it was cheaper to move to new land than to take care of the soil where they were at.
Yeah, I mean, that was the interesting thing about the way that people treated land in Western Europe versus North America in like in the 1700s and the late 1600s and throughout the 18th century, the 1700s. In Europe, you had land holdings were being consolidated. Big landowners were putting big blocks of land together, and the sort of the wealthy, if you will, was starting to experiment with soil husbandry and trying to restore fertility to their estates. while shipping people like my ancestors off to the New World as fast as they could. Whereas in North America, you had a surplus of land relative to the population. So in Europe, you had a lot of population and no unallocated land. So
you're finite. Yeah, you're kind of, we covered it all already.
Yeah, exactly. Or we divided it up amongst the rich people and everyone else had to go somewhere else. Inequality is not a recent invention. But in North America, you had the sort of inverse issue for the European colonists, where they viewed the land as there for the taking, and they had a low population. So it was the expensive part of running a farm or a plantation in North America wasn't the land, it was the labor. And that's a big part of what led to the rise of slavery and plantation agriculture in the American South, was that fundamental difference in the relationship of the nature of people to their land. And that, of course, sort of played out in the run-up of helping to set up the American Civil War, because the farming style in the North was real different. I sort of go into all that in the book, but it's a part of American history that I was never taught. I had to sort of learn it all for myself. And I was actually really quite happy when the book got reviewed. Dirt got reviewed by, it was a historical society that reviewed it and basically said, wow, this is kind of like a new take on this. Who sort of knew the land and the soil mattered so much? Maybe historians ought to pay attention to it. And I was like, yes.
That's really cool. No, I was really interested in this section. I mean, go into more. The slavery, it's very conducive for if you have very cheap labor. And just tell us about the dynamics of that and how, you could just use up the soil and then move on and just that whole thing. So interesting.
Yeah, I mean, basically with the early tobacco growing, I mean, the whole reason tobacco growing took off in the early American colonies was that was a crop that would survive shipping back to Europe, would sell at a high price, and your returns could flow back across the Atlantic in terms of goods and capital. The way they grew tobacco in colonial days was very erosive. It was like bare soil fields. If you planted it and grew it the way they did then, you would sort of lose the topsoil with it within 5 years, kind of a deal. It would just bleed off the land. And there's been great studies by geologists since then, sort of documenting where did the soil go and how did it work? And it all has been borne out, the stuff I was writing about at the time, with some more recent studies as well. But the basic problem was that if you degraded your land within a few years, what do? Well, if you still have a big forest next door, you can go chop down some trees and you have fresh land, and you just rinse, repeat, and keep moving into the forest. It's kind of like what's happening in the Amazon today with some of the peasant agriculture and the cattle that follows it. In the American colonies, you would have this setup where the land was actually pretty cheap. There was not a lot of people to do the labor, and that helped fuel the interest in and the rise of the slave trade, because people thought at that time as a way that they could buy labor. And what do you do with a workforce that is involuntarily enslaved and not particularly enthused about doing whatever it is you want them to do? I mean, I can't imagine, those kind of circumstances, but it led itself to a simple framework of, growing a few crops in ways that involved sort of minimal attention to the growing of them, and repetition of degrading the land and moving into the forest. It was the economic model that arose in the American South early on. In the North, it was very different. A lot of the early farmers who settled in Pennsylvania, like the Pennsylvania Dutch, the Germans, they were people who were coming from small farms in Northern Europe, and they tended to set up more small and diversified farming operations, more like what we would think of as a family farm today rather than a big plantation. And so the whole model of agriculture was really different in the North than in the South. I was astounded in doing this research on the run-up to the Civil War to learn that in the American South, in that era, they were importing food from the North. These big plantations, but they were growing cotton and tobacco. They were growing things you couldn't eat.
Yeah.
And because they were growing cash crop monocultures, they destroyed their land, and they were buying their food from the North before the war started.
That's so interesting. Yeah, so the northern people, they didn't have the slavery, and they also were kind of using the practices of where they came from more in Europe, where they had to be diversified and have these different systems instead of doing monocrops.
Yeah, so in doing this kind of research for this book, I got really sucked into the history of farming and thinking about how have people treated the land, and then how did that help influence cultures and set up the way people interacted with themselves, and what kind of legacy did it leave for their descendants in the end? Because, the obvious question to ask is, if you have all these civilizations that have repeated, different variations of a similar story on a regional basis, what are we doing globally? And that's where there's some scary stats that one can throw around about land degradation today at a global scale. But the longer I looked into this and met people like Gabe Brown, who you've mentioned, the more I started shifting from being a pessimist and thinking that, we may repeat at a global scale what the Romans and Greeks did to their land. Mm-hmm. And I started becoming much more optimistic about our ability to rewrite the script this time through the kind of practices that somebody like Gabe Brown actually practices. And he was an influential person that I interviewed for Growing a Revolution, but he was sort of one of a group of farmers around the world who are using regenerative farming techniques to improve their land while growing lots of crops or raising lots of livestock. And that's a recipe for totally turning around the story that I wrote about in Dirt.
Yeah, there's hope. There's hope. What are some of those scary statistics? Some people say there's 60 harvest lefts, or maybe there's less than that. If we go along the wrong path, though.
Yeah, it's that's the warning that we've got 60 harvests left and that we're going to run out of soil in a few years is kind of oversold. But the problem is that there's a major germ of truth in there. It's not that we're going to run completely out of soil. It's that we're going to run short on our ability to feed everybody. There's places in the world that can endure soil erosion for a lot longer than the next 60 years because they've got really rich, thick deposits of soil. There's other places that are going to be having serious trouble long before 60 years. It's not the same story everywhere. But the problem is that with conventional practices that are using a lot of tillage, a lot of plowing, a lot of agrochemicals, and growing a narrow range of crops, functional monocultures, 1 or 2 crops, it's a recipe for degrading the land. And there was a UN report in 2015, a global state of the soil assessment, that found that we're losing about 0.3% of our agricultural production capacity each and every year to ongoing soil loss and soil degradation. And that number is kind of like behind some of these kind of, 60 harvest left kind of estimates. Because if we keep going at the rate we're going now, you take 0.3% a year for 60 years, and you're looking at a 50% or so loss in our production capacity, 40 to 50% in our ability to feed ourselves globally. And if our population increases by 50% over that same time frame, it's going to obviously cause problems. But what's missing there is that we actually have the opportunity to change. I think agriculture must change in the 21st century, or we will run into problems down the road, whether it's in 60 years or 80 years or 100 or 100 or 200 years. The way that we raise food globally today is simply not sustainable in the sense that a geologist like myself would think about it. We've got to feed the world not just for the rest of the 21st century. We've got to keep feeding the world in perpetuity after that.
Well, there's this thing with human nature. Everyone thinks it's a bit selfishly. You just think in the short term.
Yeah.
And you don't think in the long term.
Yep, that's one of the big lessons of Dirt is that the people in Libya today are still paying for the farming practices that their ancestors were using 2,000 years ago. These kind of environmental degradation can have a long tail. And imagine that at a global scale, and it's not a pretty picture. But on the other hand, if you basically imagine the future 100 years from now where the kind of farming that Gabe Brown is practicing is called conventional because everybody's doing it, you could imagine a garden planet kind of doing to Earth what the Ticopians did to their world. Hopefully we won't have to send spacecraft off to go find new planets to colonize. But, we do have this incredible task in front of us in terms of rebuilding and revitalizing the soil right here on Earth if we're going to stay here.
Yeah, I love this hopeful message. Before we get too hopeful, I want to stick with the doom and gloom for a little longer, just to drive it home.
Back to doom and gloom.
Yeah, no, it's great. No, I love your really optimistic attitude towards this. And I think I did the same kind of thing where I was super pessimistic in the beginning and then you kind of change and evolve. But give us some numbers on like the disparity between how fast we can degrade soil and how fast we can create soil.
Yeah, if you look at the pace that nature builds soils, which is the sort of background I came to this whole issue with, it takes nature, centuries to build an inch of fertile topsoil. And you can find estimates of anywhere from a couple centuries to 1,000 years, but it's centuries and it varies around the world. So nature builds soils pretty slowly. If you look at the average pace of agricultural soil erosion in the world today, I actually published a paper on that in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences back in 2007, where I went and compiled all the data I could find out there in the scientific literature about how fast are the world's soils eroding on farms, in natural forests, in mountains, different kind of settings around the world. And what I found is that on average, we're losing about an inch of topsoil every 20 or so years, globally, off the global average. And it varies a lot. Some places are much slower, some places are much faster. But as a global average, you can look at those two numbers, that it takes nature centuries to build an inch of soil, and it's currently humanity is losing an inch of soil in decades. The numbers are off by at least one order of magnitude, if not two. And that can only go on for so long before you do run out of something. I mean, it's like we all know that, if you spend money faster than you make it, you're burning up your savings. The optimistic counterpoint to that, though, is that the thing that I sort of learned in watching my wife garden in our yard in urban Seattle, where she was building several inches of soil. She built several inches of really rich, fertile soil within about 5 years of taking over this degraded garden that was our yard and doing intensive composting and mulching and building fertile soil. So the people can actually rebuild fertile soil much faster than nature does, because if you think about nature building soil, we think about it as turning rocks into fertile soil. And, how long would a piece of granite stick around if you just went out and stuck it on a curb somewhere? It takes forever to break down.
Mm-hmm.
But if you already had a crushed pile of sand and all you needed to do is add the biology, add the organic matter, you could turn it into fertile soil in a few years.
Mm.
So where I came to be an optimist is realizing that, the difference between the long-term problem of soil degradation that different societies have seen and where we might go in the future is that if we could figure out systems of farming that actually rebuild soil organic matter. On most farms, we've got mineral matter. Mm-hmm. We've got the dirt part. What we're missing is the life and the biology these days. If you completely strip the soil off, then you might need to take a D9 in, rip up some rock, turn it into sand, and then add the biology. But the bottom line is that we could actually turn it around in decades rather than the centuries that you might imagine based on how fast it takes nature to build soil.
Mm-hmm. Well, what we really need is the incentives. Like I said, sometimes it's hard for humans to think long term, but also just the short term incentives don't match. The incentives don't align.
Yeah.
Right? It's like this capitalism doesn't work. You talked about it, right? It's just that it doesn't match up. There's no incentives to build the soil. That's the biggest thing we need to change as humans work with incentives. So yes, Gabe Brown was forced to do it, or some people are forced to do it. But when we have subsidies and all these different government programs that have kind of the opposite incentive, it's like you are set up where if you fail, you get a free pass, right? That's how the crop system works now.
Yep. Yep. Well, you'll like the last chapter in Growing Revolution when you get there. It goes into those kind of things. And you're absolutely right. One of the big problems with societies all through the past is that if you use tillage, if you use the plow, in turning the soil over and opening it up to oxidation, it enhances bacterial life, which breaks down the organic matter that's in the soil and turns that organic matter into nutrients that the plants can take up. So you get a little burst of fertility by using this method that over the long run draws down your organic matter and mines your fertility. Mm-hmm. And so you have that sort of short versus long-term incentive thing completely out of whack. And today we exacerbate it with our crop insurance programs, with our agricultural subsidy programs, our commodity crop support programs that encourage monocultures. All these things are misaligned with what it would take to promote the spread and growth of a regenerative agriculture that rebuilds soil fertility. So right now, I like to say that we've got our subsidies on backwards. We're basically encouraging people to degrade the land that our descendants are going to need to eat from.
So true. How did this start? I know the farm subsidies started in like the early 1930s. Just give us kind of like a breakdown.
Yeah, I've been tempted to try and write an article on that at some point so I can look further into it. But I've got some insight into that. I mean, a lot of them started in the Dust Bowl era and immediately afterwards as a way to help try and support and rebuild family farms. And there was thinking in those days that it would be more efficient to separate like cropping and animal husbandry, that people should specialize and grow more of fewer crops as a way to increase production and keep the cost of food down for the consumer. And those were sort of the kinds of incentives that were playing through people's minds. And we ended up with a system set up that is encouraging people to perpetuate a style of farming that we now know has very serious long-term problems and implications for society. But it's also not working out too well for farmers, because if you look at what's happened since then, as farmers came to rely more on fossil fuels rather than animal labor on farms, then as the price of fossil fuels went up, the input costs went up, and the price of fertilizer went up, price of diesel went up, price of pesticides and patented seeds all went up. And when we encouraged farmers to specialize in a small number of commodity crops, what happened to the price they got for their harvests? Well, because they got so good at growing so much of so few things, the price went down, right? Because there's a surplus of supply. So the farmers have been squeezed with their input costs going up while their income goes down per bushel of harvest. And so they're squeezed in the middle. The people selling them all the inputs, selling them the fertilizer and the diesel and the seeds, they're doing fine. The people that buy the crops from them do fine. It's the farmers that have been squeezed in the middle. So I've seen a lot of impetus come for change coming not so much from the policy sphere. I think there's room for that, and a lot of motivation for it is starting to emerge. But I've seen a lot of the drive for regenerative farming really coming out of the farming community as a way to, if you can cut people's input costs and maintain their harvests, you can make their farm more profitable. And that's a big focus of the Growing a Revolution book, is how that all works.
Yeah. There's so few farmers these days. I think you also wrote something about how, way back in the day, like 98% of people were farmers and they're feeding like the pharaohs or the kings.
Yeah.
And now we have like 1% of farmers feeding everyone else.
Completely flipped. And we want farmers to be able to feed more people than just the people on the farm, because otherwise we all have to be farmers. And civilization has benefited from our ability to specialize, and we can, you look at sort of a whole village of people. If everybody was a geologist, we'd all starve. But it's nice to have some geologists around, because otherwise we do serve a purpose. A diversity of interests and labor actually sort of helps human societies be more productive and creative, I think. But we also need the smaller community of people who are farmers to stay in business and profitable and thrive as farmers, because we rely on them for our own food.
Mm-hmm. It kind of makes sense if you look back at it. Yeah, the division of labor, we can focus on one thing and then we could be more efficient. And I like that. It's like these kind of things, but somehow it just doesn't work with food. Right. And right, it's economies of scale and we'll do this, but it's like, hey, now we're kind of realizing, oh, well, if you've heard of The Biggest Little Farm, a documentary about, they're like growing 100 different things or more in their one little farm. It's like, it's more, if you're using plants and animals together and very diverse, it's actually more efficient and you get all these synergistic effects.
I wrote a bit about that in Growing a Revolution. I think I did a piece for a website called The Conversation that looks at sort of big myths of modern agriculture. And that was like foremost among them, is that the small diversified farms are more efficient. That's the reality. The myth is that we need large agrochemical agriculture to feed the world. Mm-hmm. But if you look at how to produce the most food per hectare of land, it's small diversified farms, like that movie that you were referring to. It's not sort of large scale industrial monocultures. If you look though at what's the most efficient way to produce a single crop, it's those large-scale industrial monocultures. So one of the things actually the book that Ann and I are working on now is looking at the role of regenerative farming in the quality of the food that we eat, and how much how we farm or raise our livestock influences their nutritional quality. And one of the things that's coming out of that is that if we really wanted to promote human health globally, we would eat a more diversified diet, which means we need farmers to grow a more diversified set of crops. Because if you look at the U.S., for example, we don't grow enough fruits and vegetables in the United States to feed everybody the minimum daily recommended amounts if everybody decided to eat them.
Yeah, we're importing them, a lot of them.
Yeah, and
eating them out of season.
Even if we import, we don't come anywhere near the amount that it would take to feed everybody the minimum recommended amount. Instead, we're basically subsidizing farmers to grow corn and soybeans.
And then that gets shipped off somewhere else too. It's a crazy system we have.
Yeah. And most of it goes to feed livestock in CAFOs, or it goes to feed cars in ethanol. very little of the corn and soybeans we grow in the U.S. is actually exported overseas in terms of the total market. Yeah.
Mm.
Most of it's going to livestock or well, anyway, deal. But we could, if we really wanted to promote global health through diet, we would eat a more diversified diet.
Well, I love the nutrient density stuff on the food we eat. And yeah, just looking at the nutrition, that if you have proper soil health, it translates directly into the food you grow in it.
Yep, that's the book that we're trying to finish by this summer. Hopefully it'll be out next, not long after the next election.
I love that. I love it. And then the opposite of that is kind of what we're just talking about, is when you're doing all these big monocultures, and that's a way to grow cheap food and you can feed people at a low cost. But what we're finding out is that's not working. That didn't work. We did this experiment. That's kind of what the film I'm making, Food Lives, well, it's about a lot of things. But we cover kind of where we went wrong. And that's kind of it. It's like, we could just feed people these cheap processed products with subsidized corn, wheat, and soy. And that's going to lead us to health. And it didn't work.
It didn't work. Yep. Nope. That's the central theme that runs through the new book. It didn't work. Now, it worked to produce a whole lot of calories. Mm-hmm. But it turns out the human body needs more than we need enough calories to survive. That was not a trivial effort to actually boost global calorie production, but we need more than raw calories.
Well, yeah. Well, throughout history, we've needed calories. And that's kind of the problem we're in, right? It's like we always needed calories, but now we're calorie safe or whatever. And now our problems come in. We have too many calories.
Yeah. And, we have a whole different set of maladies and conditions that are afflicting us. So it's the argument for the book that we're coming out with is that we need another shift. It's sort of a continuation of the argument from Growing Revolution, that there's not just reasons for the environment and climate and for farmers, but there's reasons for consumer interest that we would want to pursue the expansion and development of regenerative agriculture. It's basically, it's in all of our interests from a health perspective.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about this population stuff? You're talking about it. At a certain point, we can't support a population. And you wrote about in the hunter-gatherer days, we had so much land, and it took, 20 to 100 hectares of land to support a person. And then through technology, it kept getting smaller and smaller. But there's a limit. Even though we're getting super efficient, just how much the world can support. And it's like this weird topic to talk about, but it's like kind of the problem is too many people.
Yeah, I would be hard pressed to identify a single environmental problem for the 21st century that would not benefit from there being fewer people. Uh-huh. It's the human population is a major driver for all kinds of environmental issues. And the problem of feeding a growing world is a challenging one. There's no sort of magic carrying capacity of Earth. It depends on, how much of what kind of food we grow using what kinds of technologies. Sort of all roll up into how many people we continue feeding. The bottom line, from my view as a geologist, as long as we are degrading agricultural land at a global scale, we're losing ground against human population growth just right out of the gate. You have two visions for where the world could go at present. And one is if the demand for food continues to outstrip our ability to, it starts to outstrip our ability to raise it, it'll cause social instability. It's the dark vision of the future. On the other hand, you could imagine if we could reform agriculture and get it to a regenerative corner, that you could garden the planet and essentially be able to grow more food than we do now on more diversified, smaller farms. You'd have to have, the infrastructure to get that food to people. And today, the big problem with feeding the world isn't so much growing food as in access to food and distribution of food. In the future, if we continue to degrade land at the pace we're doing it at, and the population continues to rise at the pace we're doing it at, we may have actual real global food shortages. That's not a pleasant prospect.
Well, yeah, the stats on that, we already have more than enough food to feed. Well, I don't know what the exact stats. We could feed 10 billion people with the food we have now. It's just we can't get it to them. There's this inequality. There's the logistics. There's all the infrastructure.
And we also wasted something like a third of the food that's produced.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've looked into all that stuff. It's huge. And just the environmental footprint of how much we waste is huge. I think it's way bigger than someone changing like one meatless Monday. Well, I don't believe in meatless Mondays for many reasons.
But if you look at the sort of the conventional wisdom on the difference in productivity between organic and conventional agriculture, which people peg at somewhere between 10 and 20% in terms of yield. If you actually look at the specifics of, well, first of all, the amount of food we waste globally is bigger than that difference. So straight out of the gate, the argument that organic can't feed the world is flawed because, well, if you actually didn't waste food, you could grow it all organically and close the gap. Yeah. But there's also studies that show that if you basically have organic production that builds soil fertility, that has the combined characteristics of things like no-till, cover crops, and diversity of crops, things that build fertility, that yield gap between organic and conventional closes and sometimes even disappears. So I keep going back to the argument of, it's not so much about what we eat as much as it is about how we grow it.
That's exactly what we need to get into more. So we've kind of gone through a lot of the stuff you covered in dirt and moving into the Growing Revolution book, which, I'm only halfway through, unfortunately. But so after dirt, which was 2007, I believe, you spoke at all these different conferences. You kind of traveled around, learned a lot more. And you got really into how some of the stuff we've been talking about already is how to, do this correctly, the no-till farming, the cover crops. So, I want to dive in more. There's so much to that. Like, explain no-till for people. I had Gabe Brown explain it, but just for a news person, like I had no idea what no-till meant until, 6 months ago.
Farming without the plow. So, instead of plowing up a field to break up the soil and prepare the seed bed for planting, what you do is you basically use a different piece of equipment that you can put on your tractor and go across the field that instead of churning everything up, it just carves a narrow little slot in the soil and then drops seeds down into that slot and then closes the slot up. So you're basically planting through the residue of last year's crop rather than churning up the soil and mixing it all together. And what that does is it means that after you've planted your seeds, the land is still covered with the mulch that was last year's crop stubble, and it's protected from erosion. That mulch helps to keep moisture in the soil. And since you put your seeds there, they're the ones that come up first because weeds haven't had a chance to establish. So no-till is essentially farming without the disturbance of plowing. And then if you add cover crops to it and then you rotate your crops, it's a recipe for feeding soil life and suppressing pathogens. Because if you plant corn in the same field year after year, what you've basically done is opened a grocery store for corn pests. Mm-hmm. Basically whatever landed on your corn and started nibbling on it this year is going to lay some eggs, and then those eggs will hatch out. And then when their eggs hatch out the following year, if it's still corn again, you're going to have a pest problem. If you diversify your crops so you're not growing the same thing each year, then when those corn pests hatch out and then it's barley and then the next year it's wheat, those corn pests are going to be gone by the third or fourth year because there's been nothing for them to eat.
It's so funny. The way we think we should be doing it, it's like, how can we facilitate pests the most? It's
exactly.
It's so funny. It's like we just set it up, like the recipe for the worst case.
Yeah, and it's like, it is astounding. And why did we do that? Because we're thinking about efficiency and not ecology in the scientific use of the term ecology. When you open up the hood of regenerative agriculture and kind of look at, well, what actually makes it work? It's because there's a suite of practices that we can use that work agronomically that support the beneficial life in the soil so that soil ecology works for the farmer. Whereas if you're using a whole lot of tillage and a whole lot of chemicals, you're basically working against soil ecology, like you were just pointing out, which I think is a great way to put it. We designed a system of modern agriculture that basically almost ensures that we need things like fertilizers and pesticides because we created conditions that foster soil degradation and pest proliferation. Who benefits from that kind of a system? Well, it's the people who sell you pesticides and fertilizers. It's not everybody.
It's not. And there's like big fertilizer controls everything. There's only like 2 big companies, right? And they kind of just set prices and they just control.
Yeah. One of the big attractions that I found in interviewing farmers for Growing Revolution, which I basically, after I'd gone to enough farming conferences where I'd been asked to speak about the long-term effects of soil erosion and degradation, sort of from the geological perspective, I would stick around the conferences for the day, and I'd hear farmers who were talking about, adopting regenerative practices and bringing soil back to life on their farms. And I decided I'd basically take 6 months off to go interview people who had done that, and was pretty impressed with how the suite of practices that basically boil down to no-till cover crops and diversity of crops. And, with or without livestock, you can add livestock to accelerate soil building or leave them out if you don't want to deal with animals. But how those practices could actually reverse soil degradation in pretty surprisingly short order, and how the kicker for farmers was that would allow them to reduce their expenditures for fertilizer, for pesticides, for herbicides, insecticides. And now there's many even questioning how much they need patented seeds, because when they bring their soil ecology back online, working for their interests, they get healthier, more resilient crops that don't need as much water, fertilizer, or pesticide. And that saves them money. I haven't yet to meet a farmer who really likes buying a lot of inputs.
Yeah, well, I want to get into the monetary stuff, and that's super important. But you bring up the interest. What really stood out to me is feeding the world, right? You mentioned, how are we going to feed the world? And the people who say we can't feed the world with organic farming, regenerative farming, are the people who have the interest in making money, or the systems that exist, or these, you know what I mean? These powers that be. No one's asking if we can feed the world the few people like Gabe Brown or yourself who know what they're talking about.
Yeah, there's a big disparity in what kind of research actually gets supported as well. Where if you look at how agronomic research is supported and funded globally, a lot of it comes from those industries that you were just mentioning. There's really not much of a funding pool, and therefore a thinner depth of sort of scientific papers that go into this sort of full system of regenerative agriculture involving all three pieces. And part of that is scientists' fault. We tend to want to break a system down into its individual pieces and study them individually. And one of the lessons I came home with after researching Growing a Revolution was that the recipe for regenerative agriculture is really about a new system of farming. It's not just about no-till. It's not just about cover crops. And it's not just about diversity. It's about combining all three of them into a new system. And the few studies that I've found in the literature that have actually addressed issues like fertilizer use, yields, and productivity for farms that adopt all three of those measures, you see, no real yield gap. I started calling farmers like Gabe Brown organic-ish farmers, because they had so reduced their chemical use that they might as well be organic. Even if they technically weren't. And their yields were better than their conventional neighbors. So it's sort of the idea that we have to rely on disturbance and agrochemical intensive agriculture to feed the world, to me, has been demonstrated to be false, because there are examples of people who are doing other more organic-ish or organic approaches, particularly on the small diversified farms, that are outproducing conventional farms. We don't tend to hear much about that. Because the narrative that, without modern agriculture, so to speak, we'll all starve, is so deeply entrenched in the media.
It's deeply entrenched, and the interests are misaligned. It's the same thing. I always draw the parallels between, because I'm in the whole nutrition world, and health and doctors and research on nutrition is not aligned with the big food companies making the money. And it's the same thing. No one's out there making billions of dollars selling someone farmers market, organic meat and vegetables, and there's no money in it. So of course there's no research in it, and they're not talking. None of the incentives line up. These voices aren't heard. It's the same with how food is produced. Very
strong parallels. And there's strong parallels in the medical world too, where if you look at the agricultural world, the things that I've been advocating and talking about are practices that farmers can pick up and do. They can learn them. They don't have to buy them. There's not a market for developing a lot of products to feed the regenerative agriculture farming community, because it is rooted in changes in practices. Same holds in the medical world, where we kind of know that diet and lifestyle are the big drivers of a whole lot of chronic issues and problems, diseases in the Western world today. But our medical establishment is primarily set up not around preventative medicine, but around managing the symptoms of people who have developed those kinds of diseases, where you could argue that there would be a much more societally beneficial approach to invest heavily in how do we actually produce more fresh fruits and vegetables for people to eat? How do we get them to them? How do we provide affordable access to healthy food and encourage people to actually consume it as preventative medicine? Most of the medical research goes into developing new drugs to treat the side effects of chronic heart disease, obesity, a lot of the other conditions that have roots in diet, but that play out in the public health sphere.
It's crazy. It's so hard to change the system, but we'll try to do what we can here. So tell us more about the other pillars of this conservation agriculture. I mean, you told us a bit more about no-till farming, but then cover crops. How do those work?
Yeah, so you basically the sort of the three pillars of regenerative agriculture are no-till, cover crops, and a diversity of crops. And then we can get to the livestock add-on as sort of as a separate piece. But the cover crops are basically, the idea is that you don't let your land sit bare and fallow. And the idea is that if you have living roots in the soil, those plants are pushing out what are known as exudates into the soil, which are compounds, sugar-rich compounds, proteins. There's even fats that plants will push out into the soil. And they do that to feed the microbes in the soil that in return provide the plants things like minerals that they scour from the soil, or metabolites they make out of those sugars that they consume that are things like growth hormones for plants. There's this two-way street in exchange that in the book that my wife, Anne Baclay, and I wrote, The Hidden Half of Nature, we talk about as a underground biological bazaar, this great trading system where plants are feeding the soil life and the soil life is helping to nourish the plants. And cover crops are a way to do that. They also help prevent erosion. So if you keep the soil in place and then you feed the life that's in the soil, it's a recipe for growing more beneficial life, because the plants are not putting out exudates to feed pathogens. They're putting out exudates tailored to attract and sustain communities of soil organisms that benefit the plant. And those partnerships go back to the first colonization of plants on land some 450 million years ago. There's a big evolutionary literature on it. And then the diversity, the third pillar, is where if you have a diverse set of plants growing in the same soil, they will produce a diverse set of exudates that attract a diverse set of microbes. And it's kind of like you're thinking about, there's many more positions on the team of soil life, if you will, if you have a diversity of organisms in it. A baseball team that was all catchers would probably not make it to the World Series. They just not do everything a baseball team needs to do. And you think it's soil life similarly. If you have just a few species, the plants have fewer opportunities to partner with microbial allies in the soil. So those three things, the no-till, the cover crops, and the diversity, is kind of a recipe for the care and feeding of life that can benefit the crops that the farmer wants to see there. And you can think of livestock as a way to accelerate the process, in the sense that if, like at Gabe Brown's farm that I'm sure he talked about, where he can get his livestock in to graze off the residue of his cover crops or his market garden, his vegetable crops that he sells at the farmers markets, what those livestock can do by consuming that organic matter, the standing residue from the crops, is they turn it into manure that is a much more readily uptakeable form by soil life. So they're accelerating the breakdown of that organic matter. You could think of the cows as sort of self-propelled methane digesters that are accelerating the process of cycling of nutrients in the soil. So I've come to sort of see that the designed use of livestock on a ranch or farm can actually help rebuild soil organic matter and improve soil fertility, which is really different than the story you get from conventional meat production, where you're degrading cornfields with conventional agriculture to feed animals that are basically in jail, and whose manure then becomes a toxic lagoon rather than a resource to feed soil life. It's all about how we raise stuff.
It's so different. It's so different. Yeah, I mean, mixed farms, I love just using them all together, and rotational grazing, and you can even have the chickens involved in this process too, and they could come in and eat all the little maggots and worms and their own fertilizer dropping along the way.
Yeah, so they can turn maggot into eggs. It's great.
It's a miracle.
Yeah,
I mean, these animals are nature's miracle, and I mean, it's almost not a miracle. It's just, this is nature. It seems like a miracle as we try to develop all these crazy technologies, and we're like, hey, this cow just does it for you. It's like
Yeah.
a robot that just, a bio robot that just turns things into manure. So I don't know why people hate on them so much.
Well, perhaps because of the way that we raise them. It's basically a problem. It may be sort of, I forget what the psychological term for that is. It's not really projection, but it's displacement or something, where it may be with the system that we have in place to raise livestock conventionally is a bad system, but it's probably a mistake to blame the cows for that. The blame for that lies with people. It's how we do it.
So you're talking about diversity. So there's nitrogen fixing plants, like legumes can put nitrogen back in the soil.
Yeah, well, they partner with microbes in the soil. So the plants aren't actually producing the nitrogen. What they do is they produce exudates that attract nitrogen fixing bacteria that then move into nodules on the roots of the plants. And they set up shop as a little factory to convert N2, nitrogen gas, into ammonia, which then the plants can then convert into nitrates and nitrites and take up into their bodies. And it's important that plants do that because, we're, as animals, we need nitrogen in our bodies because that's the building blocks of proteins, which our bodies are mostly made out of. So plants are mostly made out of carbohydrates, but they also produce proteins and they fix nitrogen. But it's through these microbial partnerships that they actually pull that off.
So plants grow from CO2 from the air, and they get their minerals from rocks. I kind of want to know more about this whole process. You've kind of told us a lot about it. And then there's also fungi. How does this whole system work? It's this like perfect cycle.
Well, so you can think of what a plant can do is their ability to photosynthesize. They can capture carbon from the atmosphere in the form of CO2, and they can combine it with water to make sugars. That's the foundation of terrestrial ecosystems, that capturing of solar energy and turning it into energetic forms. And that partnership with nitrogen-fixing bacteria in their roots, they can get nitrogen, so they can conceivably start to put proteins together. But if you look at what it takes to actually build and maintain life, healthy plants or healthy animals, you need more than just carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. That's 4 elements. We need things like iron. We need some copper. We need some zinc. There's all these micronutrients. We need calcium. We need magnesium, sort of major elements. There's a half a dozen or so of major elements that the bulk of life is made up out of. But then there's a couple dozen micronutrients that are also important, less for growth and more for functionality of things like proteins and enzymes. And so all those mineral elements, the things like the zinc and the iron and the copper, where does that come from? It comes from rocks. So we need bacteria and fungi to help break down rocks and weather them, convert them get those elements out of the minerals and into water, where a plant can then suck it up through its roots. And plants have only, if you think about how much surface area plants have with their roots, they only touch so much soil. Things like zinc are not very common in soil. Phosphorus isn't either, for that matter, unless you fertilize it. And so these partnerships have evolved since plants colonized the continents, whereby fungi have specialized in getting some of those mineral elements and bringing them to plants and trading them for those exudates that the plants produce, the sugars and the other compounds that plants will leak out of their roots. That turns out to be actually pretty critical and central to providing plants with all the elements they need to support their bodies. And if we're eating crops that don't have the same mineral content, then we're getting less of those minerals because we can't eat rocks. We have to get the minerals from our food. We need plants and bacteria and fungi to eat rocks for us, so we can then eat the plants and harvest those minerals that are important for our bodies. That's where the role of soil life really comes in, because they help facilitate the movement and cycling of those nutrients. And when we plow or when we use too much nitrogen fertilizer, we use too much herbicide, we can change the community structure of the life in the soil, and that can actually in turn affect the movement of elements out of the soil and into plants and animals and people. And that's all what my new book is going to be all looking at.
I love it. I love it. So I said we're going to get back to the profitability part and just even the numbers of how much we can grow using these regenerative methods compared to conventional methods. So I know there's studies in 2015, there was a couple like meta-analysis and stuff, But tell us about, the yield, because sometimes they'll show it's a bit less, but I don't know if that was accurate, and that even if it is a bit less, in some cases for the farmer specifically, they can get more money from these organic produce that if they sell it.
Well, there's a difference right out of the gate there between organic and regenerative. They're not the same thing. In the sense that, with organic, there's a certification. It mostly boils down to not using a certain sets of prescribed or banned chemical inputs. Whereas regenerative is more about the sort of rebuilding soil health, sort of a different perspective on it. There's been a lot of studies that have tried to look at the nutritional difference between organic and conventional agriculture, and also at the yield. And, usually they come up, these kind of meta studies will often come up with a 5, 10 to up to 15 or 20% yield penalty for organic, meaning organic yields are, 10, 20% lower than conventional yields. But if you actually get in and parse a lot of those studies, an awful lot of the comparisons that lead to that disparity are things where people will plant the same conventional cultivar, same conventional crop variety in soil that's been conventionally managed for years. And then they try growing it without fertilizer, and they grow it with fertilizer, and the one with fertilizer has higher yield. And it's like, duh.
Yeah.
And then there's lots of studies like that get swept into these meta-analyses. If you just look at the few examples where people have compared conventional practices where you have, tillage with lots of fertilizer and agrochemicals, and you have regenerative practice where you do those full sort of no-till cover crops and diversity, the yield difference is usually, there's not a lot of studies, but the ones that I've seen don't have much in the way of a yield difference. In other words, these regenerative practices are competitive on yield with conventional. Some of the regenerative practices in those kind of comparisons are not completely organic. There are people like Gabe Brown, who I think has only recently weaned himself completely off of agrochemicals. But for many years, he was what I call organic-ish, where he was hardly using any, but he would use them as needed, but not routinely. So I think there's actually a huge potential to convert what we now consider conventional agriculture to this organic-ish style of agriculture, and thereby greatly reduce our agrochemical use, help start to rebuild soil fertility, and not pay the kind of a steep yield penalty that you often find invoked in discussions about how to feed the world.
Absolutely. And these studies showed they actually help the soil and sequestered carbon and all these things that aren't immediately profitable or increase the yields, but in the long term would.
And there's an interesting study that in working on the new book where people were looking at nitrogen fertilizer application rates and sort of what's the economically optimal rate of fertilizer to apply. And I think it was in the Southeast somewhere. And basically the answer came back that if you have the level of fertilizer use that the sort of the university agronomists were in that region were recommending was basically equivalent to what would be optimal if you had zero organic matter, if you had dead soil. But that if you had 3, 4, or 5% organic matter, if you had organic matter rich soil, the economically optimal amount of nitrogen fertilizer to use was 0.
Oh, wow.
That basically, in other words, if you have healthy, fertile soil, you don't need much in the way of fertilizers to be competitive in terms of yield. That's where the call in Growing Revolution for a global effort to rebuild the health and fertility of the world's soils, I think I like to call it sort of the best investment humanity could make in its future, or one of the best investments humanity could make in its future would be to rebuild the organic matter content and the health and fertility of the world's soils, because it could help wean ourselves off of things like nitrogen fertilizer, it helped us feed the world in the 20th century, but I think we've got to figure out how to get to use a lot less of it in the 21st and 22nd centuries.
Yeah, that's the future. And going back to, we're saying how few farmers there are these days, and before we were all farmers, I don't see a problem with having more farmers. I mean, I'm doing a presentation about this too. It's kind of like, how can we feed the world in the future? And then there's all these different jobs. It's like, oh, well, robots are going to take our jobs, like self-driving cars and self-driving trucks. Not everyone wants to work in an office. So how about we make it attractive and profitable to work as a farmer? Some honest work. I'm sure a lot of people would be happy to do it if they could make a good living. And I don't know if it's just a societal shift in the perception of being a farmer, but in the future, I think this is the future of our world.
I mean, that's where we should be sort of aligning our subsidies and our agricultural programs, would be to figure out ways to make small scale farming a profitable living again.
Yeah. And it's possible. We know that it's possible, kind of, right? Let's talk about the numbers. That's actually what kind of, we're kind of nearing the end here, but I think I only found one good thing online about someone running the numbers. If we were to use livestock and use these mixed farming methods to feed our country, let's just say to the U.S. Can we do that? We have enough land.
Oh, I think we will be able to feed the U.S. Yes. I mean, I think if we just reprogrammed all the food that's going to feed CAFOs and cars, we could feed the U.S. no problem.
We have a lot of land here. Yeah.
Feeding the world is a trickier story and subject, but I think that we have the potential to go a long way towards doing that with a regenerative style of agriculture. And over the long run, I don't think we have any other real option, because it's as soon as you think about it in sort of these simple terms of, if we're eroding soil faster than we're building it, we're running out of it. That it just takes playing out the clock, whether that's 20 years or 200, to get to a disaster. On the other hand, if our farming practices are building soil fertility as a consequence of intensive farming, then we're increasing our ability to feed the world over time. Only one of those models is sustainable.
It's so obvious once you know it, but I don't know. Maybe just because I'm on social media and stuff and I get attacked by vegan activists, that they don't have this concept in their head, and all they're doing is taking the CAFO situation and saying that that's how we're going to do things forever and that we're screwed. Like, no, that's not the situation at all.
It's not the only option that we have. It's definitely not the only option. And my argument for both the plant-based diet world and the sort of the meat-based diet world, or if you will, is that we basically need to fundamentally reconceive how we produce in both spheres. And we have really good examples to follow in terms of regenerative grazing or regenerative farming, that we need to try and encourage those better, more regenerative models to become the new conventional. And then, 100 years from now, vegans can eat what they want to eat. People want to eat meat, what they want to eat, as long as we're growing the soybeans right, as long as we're raising the cattle right, we can pull it off.
I love that. So what do you think are the biggest things we can do to get there in, say, 1 year, 5 years? Like, what kind of changes can we make? How do we get towards this idealistic future that you and I dream of?
Well, the immediate challenge is making people aware. And so, the purely self-interested suggestion I'll make is buy copies of Growing a Revolution and give them to
I'll promote that.
Everywhere.
I second that. Okay.
Yeah. But the real answer is, I think what we really need is both to foster bottom-up interest in farming communities, where I see a lot of interest at present, but also in terms of consumer groups, and to trying to stress that there are some nuances to what should we eat kind of a question. But the really big one that I think we need the most movement on is in the policy world. We have our subsidies completely backwards. We haven't recognized that, the way that we farm is actually really important beyond just producing cheap commodity crops. It sets the foundation for what we all have to eat, which sets the foundation for our collective health. And I would love to see a lot of effort going into reframing the farm bill for the next time it comes around, because what's in that bill, that one piece of legislation, has a huge impact on what gets grown in the United States.
How does that work? Tell us a little more.
Basically, through the way that we structure crop subsidies, through the way that we structure commodity crop programs, through the way that we structure like the conservation reserve program, where we pay people to take land out of production when fallowing is not necessarily the best use of land. What we should be doing is encouraging and rewarding farmers who grow a more diverse set of crops. In other words, don't have price supports for corn. Instead, figure out ways to incentivize farmers to grow more barley, more of other crops. those kinds of tweaks and changes would, I think, have a big impact. Because as you mentioned at the start of the podcast, I think, was that people are pretty good at responding to incentives. Mm-hmm. So if we align the incentives in the agricultural sphere towards encouraging people to take better care of their soil and to grow a more diversified suite of crops, they need to be able to sell those crops. If you don't have access to a market for peas, you're not going to be growing peas. Mm-hmm. There's a lot that I think that could be done in a fresh look at and reconceiving of how we structure our sort of agricultural policy world. Right now, it's too much on producing commodity crops and selling agricultural inputs.
Yeah. Is that realistic? Who's behind this? Is there advocacy groups that are trying to change this?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of groups. There's a fair amount of I think, interest growing in farming communities, because farmers, I think, are starting to recognize that they are trapped between high input costs and low commodity prices. And what can you do to solve that? Well, you can reduce the amount you spend on inputs, and you can raise the value of the crops that you're actually growing, which may mean grow something other than corn and soybeans. But they have to be able to sell it if they're going to be able to grow it. So there's all this infrastructure. And like, if people are going to be bringing livestock back onto small farms, we need small abattoirs. We need the ability for farmers to then sell that livestock when that livestock comes to the end of its productive life or its intended use. And we dismantled that. I was astounded when I was visiting farmers, I think it was in North Dakota, who were saying that they had to send their cattle out of state for slaughter.
That's the problem. So abattoirs, for anyone who doesn't know, that's where they process and kill the animal. And that there's so many laws that, that's why they have to send it out of state, right? There's so many regulations.
Is that many of those laws were set up to sort of ostensibly to protect food quality. And then you look at, where do the big outbreaks of pathogens in the meat supply come from? It's the big processors. Mm-hmm. They're not coming from the small ones. What we need are good quality control on small ones. The most humane, I visited a slaughterhouse once that was the most humane way I could imagine of how it would be set up. I don't want to go into the details, but it was because it was a whole different way of doing that than what you see with sort of the big slaughterhouses with terrified animals.
Is that her name, Temple Grant, who made that started this new, more humane way of slaughtering animals?
Oh, I don't know. This was sort of a single thing where basically animals were brought in one at a time. They barely knew. Yeah. Didn't really realize what was going on. There was no fear. There was no panic. It was a whole different game. I would love to see somebody actually test the stress hormone level in the meat that's produced through those more humane ways versus what's done in a conventional slaughterhouse. It's that one of those would be a better product for people to eat.
Oh, absolutely. I've talked to many farmers online, in person, social media, while I'm interviewing them all. Yeah, that very much agree that it's a better quality meat, obviously better for the animal. And I did actually go interview a farmer in Canada who had his own abattoir and did it all completely, just no idea what was going on. 1 minute it's live, 1 minute's gone. Right. It's really amazing way to do things. Yeah.
So it just gets back to the point that, the problem with agriculture may not be so much what we're raising or growing, but how we're doing it.
Yeah, incentivize the correct ways to do it. Bring back, some of these laws. I think so many things in our world of health, you said the doctors and nutrition world, pharmaceutical world, everything gets pushed down this way of efficiency, and then we get caught up in it and we realize that it went south and we need to kind of revamp the whole system. And so it's the same thing with, you said these laws were put in place for safety at one point, and maybe, this raw milk thing, we need to homogenize and pasteurize milk because of safety. But now we're like, oh wait, that's taking out all these enzymes that are beneficial and this and that. And, maybe it's better if we could make raw milk legal in all the states. Just so many things need to be relooked at.
Yep, this is true. The optimistic view is that this is the century where we get to relook at these things and try and rethink and redesign how we live on the world and how we use land to raise our food, and how we reconceive the system to be better, not just for our own health, but for the stability of sort of the natural world, if you will.
Absolutely. Well, let's leave it on this positive note. Would you have a bass guitar coming in?
Yeah, I play in a band, a bass in a band called Good Bones. It's check us out on Spotify. And I also play guitar in a band called Big Dirt. We're also on Spotify. But
I'm guessing you chose a name.
I chose Big Dirt, and I think I made up the Good Bones name too, but I did that by accident. But they're both good. They're fun bands. We put a bunch of albums out. But yes, I have a bass guitar sitting down in the shipping dock. That's my next stop, is to go see what I've just purchased.
All right, I'll let you go do that. Thanks so much for coming on and educating us.
No worries, Brian. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
All right, hope you enjoyed it. I sure did. You can check David Montgomery out on Twitter at dig2grow. That's dig the number 2 grow, or search for his Facebook page and get his books. You can also go to dig the number 2grow.com. And please support this show by sharing with a friend or giving it a review on iTunes or the podcast app. Check out sapien.org. You'll find a whole bunch of stuff going on there. Links out to other stuff like nosetotale.org, where you can get the grass-finished meat. Foodlies.org, where you can pre-order the film. And patreon.com/peakhuman, where you can support this show directly. Thanks so much. Stay happy and healthy, and I'll see you next week.